Okay, welcome to Veins and Arteries. With this, we're going to try to end our discussion of the circulatory system. So this is kind of, we're getting out into the periphery with arteries and veins, and we hope that will be useful to you. I got to see, can I get my pointer working here? Laser. So if we think about veins and arteries, we both know that they carry blood. They're involved in oxygen exchange, nutrient exchange, that blood is the highway that everything moves through. We'll talk more about those as we get to the lungs and liver and things like that. Both the arteries and veins have a one-way flow. Blood only moves one way through the system, and when we get a defect, we get blood moving in two directions. That's when we get into trouble. The veins and the arteries, at one end they have the heart, at the other end they have the capillaries. It's different from a flow direction for both the veins and the arteries. The arteries start at the heart, end at the capillaries. Veins start at the capillaries, end at the heart. So two diagrams here. Looking at those, these are kind of a cartoon representation of the artery versus the vein. So you've got your vein, your artery over here, and then your vein here. And we got a list of things that are in common. What's important here is to see the differences in proportion. The artery has to handle a lot of pressure, so it's designed to resist that pressure, to manage that pressure. So we've got more smooth muscle here, so that thickness compared to there. We've got more elastic tissue, that connective tissue that's going to hold things together to keep it from bursting through that. You also have the endothelial lining. In both cases, individual cells, these plaid, this diamond things here are individual cells. The endothelium is one cell thick, so you got these flattened pancake-like cells that are connected together. The veins, we have a little less smooth muscle, a little less connective tissue holding it together. It doesn't have to deal with the pressures moving through. We've got the valves in the veins that are going to help us make sure the flow goes in one direction. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So here's a transverse section of our artery. That's A, and then B over here is our vein. You can see that robustness that was illustrated in that cartoon in real life. A lot of smooth muscle, and then you got that extensive connective tissue around the side, holding it together, allowing some springiness to handle the pressures that the arteries are under. If you remember that diagram we had at the end of right before you left for break, we had the high pressures working their way down to almost nothing in the capillaries and then the veins. So the arteries, the bigger vessels, got to handle that pressure load. Our veins are not going to be under that load, so you're not going to have the thickness, you're not going to have the robustness of those individual vessels. As the pressure falls down, as the flow ebbs through, we see like when we use a muscle, the veins tend to uh, fill up as the muscle gets pumped through, as the muscle draws more blood, the veins open up, but if they're not getting flow at the moment, they tend to collapse down. So you're seeing something that's not nearly as robust, a little bit going through. Here's a cartoon kind of again representing those differences, your artery here and then your vein over here. Again, you've got the difference in muscle there. So arteries and veins are both responsible to nervous and endocrine signals to the muscle, but your artery has to work harder against those pressures, so we got more muscle. You've got the connective tissue around the outside, the elastic tissue in the middle, and then we got again the endothelium in the center. So these two are kind of on a different scale than this. Think of this capillary representation as closer to you. So if we look at the capillary, we have individual cells kind of flattened out and connected together to form the pipe. just like they used to do in the old days with lead. They'd pound it out into a sheet and then they'd fold it around and close it up to make a tube out of it. At least that's the way the Romans did. And you'd have this pipe. So you've got one cell here, kind of going around, and then another cell kind of here that are forming that handshake to form that tube. That endothelium is kind of the same size cells here, but you have a much bigger diameter, therefore more cells that are going to make up that diameter, that outer lining. But our capillaries are much smaller. So if we compare and contrast our arteries and veins, we can think about, we had some similarities, let's think about the differences. So arteries and veins, we've seen in the pictures, the walls are different. We've got thick arteries, more smooth muscle, more elastic. They got to handle those pressures. Our veins are thinner. They don't have to handle the pressures. There's a certain amount of ebb and flow that may go through those veins, as we see when muscles work. We see that the veins tend to pump up um, when they're not working as hard. Maybe they're not as full as they might be. How is the direction of flow controlled? In the arteries, it's all about pressure and elasticity. So you have the heart at the beginning of the arteries generating a force, and then the pressure goes downhill to the capillaries through the artery. So you've got the walls managing that and pushing it, collapsing it, moving it forward to the lower pressures of the capillaries. Coming back from the capillaries, we don't have that pressure anymore. And one of the things we rely on to make sure that the blood in the veins flows in the right direction is a valve. So we have a lot of valves in the veins, as we saw in that diagram, that as the blood gets squeezed along, it only goes in one direction. The valves can only open one. It's kind of a check valve. So we see in our muscles are designed to kind of squeeze those veins, increase the pressure, and then the pressure is relieved by going through those one-way valves. And through a series of one-way valves, the blood will find its way back to the heart. So when we're moving, the blood is moving through our veins. We get into trouble, like when we sit on an airplane to fly across the world and we don't move for 10 hours. Blood, our muscles are not moving as much, are not contracting as much. The blood pools, we get clots, and then we get into trouble. We mentioned in a number of different areas the difference between the pressures, high in the arteries, low in the veins. We've alluded to this. Where do you see them? On a limb, you're going to see veins are more superficial. They're closer to the surface, looped with the arteries. The arteries are going to tend to run deep inside the limb. So they tend to be paired. A lot of times, certainly as they enter and leave, they're going to be sort of paired together as we saw in that picture before. By definition, arteries, the direction of flow, they are taking blood away from the heart. In the systemic system, that's high oxygen. In the um, lung system, that's low oxygen. It's the opposite in the veins, as the by definition, the veins are going back to the. I'm going to ask you to learn selected veins and arteries, the ones I think are kind of relevant or important to get a handle on in some way, shape, or form. So, what I want you to know, we got a list of numbers here that are associated with the diagrams. You have those that you can print out. What parts of the body does each of these vessels serve, and do they drain or fill? So, if you know it's an artery, you know it's going to fill a part of the body. If it's a vein, you know it's going to drain a part of the body. And then we just have to figure out moving forward what each of these numbered ones do. So you have a PowerPoint that you can print out the full page from the Atlas of Bovine Anatomy that's got the picture up top for arteries and veins. and at the bottom it's got a key that corresponds to these numbers. So here's our artery diagram. We've got the left side of the cow here. We're looking at that lateral view from the side. And each of these numbers corresponds to a number on the key. Again, this is from the Atlas of Bovine Anatomy. We're going to use a select amount of uh, arteries here. So the ones that are important, we've circled. So if we take a look at those, we'll go through them in numeric order. Again, you have this diagram, and then the key or numbers are at the bottom of that full page that I gave you. We only have half page here in an effort to make things a little easier to understand and see. So we're going to start with our number 1 here, right there, this little artery there. It's leaving the heart, going to the lungs. It's our pulmonary artery. So that's going to split and it's going to go in 2 directions, one side to the left, one side to the right. So that's the pulmonary circulation. Then we have number 2 here. We're sort of dividing, well, 2 is the aorta, the aortic arch that comes out of the top of the heart, and all blood starts in this vessel. Our first branch is number 4 here, which is called the brachiothoracic trunk. And that's going to come out here and eventually supply the head through another artery and the foreleg with one. But for the short section here, we've got the brachiocephalic trunk, which is really the first branch off the aorta in the systemic blood system. Moving a little farther along, we have 15 here, 16 here. We're going to do the bicarotid trunk is the first part of the branch off, and then we slip over to the common carotid artery as we go up the neck. Both of these are going to supply blood to the brain, the head. And the reason I bring this one up is because this one lies directly under the jugular. The jugular is where you're trying to do that IV in the neck. And if you go too far, I've done it a few times, especially when I was learning, you go through the jugular, you hit the artery, and you're going to get a big spurt of blood, and it's going to continue to spurt. You take that needle out, you usually get a big hematoma as that blood vessel under pressure leaves a lot of blood out, and until it gets back pressure and clots, you usually have a big hematoma there that usually causes you some trouble. The next one on our list is number 30. We're going to call that the brachial artery. So that you got a right and a left one that's going to supply the legs, the front legs. So brachial is for the front legs. We go from there to 38 over here, and we're leaving the aortic arch and going to the thoracic aorta. So this is a big branch here. We have lots of branches off in a lot of different directions, but we're talking about that aorta as it passes through the thoracic cavity. So you can think about it with the vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae. That section of the aorta is associated with the thoracic region. We move a little bit farther down, we get to section 40 here. We branch in, the thoracic artery keeps branching. One of the main branches going off is that abdominal aorta. So we've left the rib cage, we've passed through the diaphragm, and now we're in the abdomen. You're going to have a lot of branches off of here that are going to supply the things below the diaphragm, the liver, the intestines, the stomach, the reproductive system are all going to kind of branch off from this area. Then we're moving down here to discuss the arteries that are going to feed the udder. So with the udder, you're going to have some branching off the abdominal artery. You're going to have the external peduncle, that's our 63. You've got an iliac, I think that's, yeah, external iliac then the external pudendal artery, and you're going to have down here to the two arteries that supply the udder. So you have with the iliac and the pudendal, you have a right and left side. So the right side is going to do the fore and rear udder on the right side of the cow, and the left is going to do on the left udder. So you have a common artery going down to each side, and then you split cranial and caudal. If you're looking at 64 and 65, you have cranial, caudal, and cranial. So basically, each of the four mammary glands has its own artery. So that's important to note, individual blood supply, and that's sort of what defines the udder. You have the blood supply there, you have all the things associated with that. All the nutrients are funneled out to that secretory tissue section, and more or less each artery sort of defines where the quarters are. If you look at your handout there with the artery, you'll notice there are two 65s labeled there. The 66 should be, the second 65 should be 66. So note that in your thing there. The last thing we're going to talk about here is the femoral artery. The femoral artery is the thing that's going to supply our back leg. So we need to kind of know those, get a feel for those different arteries. And remember, arteries always fill. You just have to know what section of the body they're taking blood to. So veins. Again, we have a lateral view of the cow. Now, the one with previous we had was artery. This is veins. So what are we doing here? Had a couple different things moving through. So if we again do them in alphabet or numeric order, we're going to start with the cranial vena cava. That's right through here, right the initial branch coming into the right atrium. So you have that coming in that basically drains the top half of the body, the cranial vena cava, or you could call it the superior vena cava. We go from 6 to 14. So we have this vein down here. Most of us call that the milk vein. And if you notice in parentheses on your form there, it is listed there. But the official name is the cranial superficial epigastric vein. So that has a formal name, and it comes out, drains the front of the udder, and eventually hooks up with the superior vena cava. We go from 14 to 19 here. Our external jugular is the one we'll put that neck IV into. So knowing the formal name there, you probably already know that. We go from 19 to 42, and this is the other vena cava that feeds into that right atrium. We have the caudal vena cava, or the inferior vena cava. From there, we're going to go to 46 is our portal vein. We'll talk more about that as we move forward, but that's a real important part of the digestive system. We have everything from the intestines, both the large and small, in the stomach, all are going to drain into the portal vein. And when we're talking about a cow, we're looking at something, milking cow, it's probably 6 inches in diameter. So all the blood from the intestines, the stomach, drains to the portal vein, and then the portal vein goes over to the liver. So everything draining out of the digestive system, its first shot, its first place to go is the liver. The liver gets first crack of everything. So that portal vein is a connection between the capillary beds of the guts and the capillary beds of the liver. And there's a vein in between. That's an unusual thing. We see that in the hypothalamus, or no, the pituitary gland, a couple other places, but this one, huge one, because all the blood coming off the stomach, all the blood coming off of the intestines, and the liver gets to handle that first. And then we're going to jump over here to the veins and the venous drainage associated with the udder. Again, you're going to have external pudendal vein up here matched with the artery on the other side. You're going to have uh, a caudal drainage and then a cranial drainage coming through. Um, so you're going to have a possibility for the udder to drain up into the caudal vena cava. You also have the possibility of drainage coming back and into the superior vena cava or the cranial vena cava. That's a unique kind of arrangement. On the top of the udder, there sits a circle of veins, and with those veins, the blood going into them can exit in those two directions, either coming through the caudal vena cava or going along the belly to come into this cranial vena cava. That's probably a good adaptation with our cows lying down the way they do. There may be some pressure points. They may pinch off those veins in one way, shape, or form, depending how they're laying or standing. The fact that we have an opportunity to go in two different directions, should pressure be there, gives us options. This will lessen back pressure, and milk flow is a function of blood flow through the udder. So if we don't have any back pressure, we got two ways to relieve it. We can put more blood through the udder. I think the ratio is 500 gallons of blood gives us a gallon of milk. Might be 200. I can't remember off the top of my head. I probably should go look it up before I talk about it. But the more blood we get through the udder, the more milk we produce, and that's pretty important when we're thinking about our dairy cows. The last one we're going to talk about is 73. We have the femoral vein that's going to be paired with the femoral artery. So something to think about here. We'll ask you to think about it more. But I've been told, nah, you got to get it in the neck vein. You can't put it in the milk vein. So if you're doing an IV, anatomically, I'm not sure what the difference is. If they're both going to go into the heart this way, I don't see what the difference is. I probably should ask a vet why that common dogma exists. But for my if you're trying to get a bottle of calcium gluconate, I don't care what vein you can get as long as you get it in the vein. That's me. For arteries and veins, what we're asking you to remember is what part of the body does each of these serve? Our arteries and veins. And then for our arteries, we remember that they need to fill and our veins drain. So just figuring out, is it drain the back leg, the front leg, the head, fills the thoracic cavity, feeds the bottom half of the body, top half of the body. Those are what I'm looking for, and we'll get that in your assignments as we move forward. So we have any questions on the cardiovascular system, please put those up on the discussion board so we can answer those questions. I'm not sure how we're going to handle the last three questions moving forward. I'm still trying to sort that out. But put some questions up there and we give you credit that way. Think about something for you to ponder as we go forward. Why doesn't blood flow back into the veins with the atrium contracting? So we don't have any valve at the top of the heart. We just got that valve between the atrium and ventricle, the AV valve. Why doesn't blood shoot back? So give that some thought. You should be able to answer that with what we've discussed about here today. Okay, I'm going to call that the end. Hopefully this works.